This is Block 9, the Liberal Establishment, Section 5, the Cold War beyond Vietnam, with the section beginning the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs and this entire next section has to do with Cuba. Castro rose to power, and here's Fidel. Castro rose to power in 1959, and many anti-communist Cubans were forced to flee the island. They fled to the United States, where they begged the Eisenhower administration to invade Cuba, force Castro from power, get rid of his communist dictatorship, and reinstall a free, pro-West, pro-American, anti-Soviet government in Cuba. These Cuban exiles, as they were called, argued that all they needed was American air support. The exiles said, with American air support, they themselves will land. We don't need American troops. All we need is American air power. And here's a picture of some of the exiles. They said that if the United States provided the air power, they would invade Cuba, the population would rise up against Castro, the United States would be rid of Castro, Cuba would be rid of Castro, and everybody goes home happy, except for Castro and the Soviets. And if Castro and the Soviets aren't happy, then everybody in the United States is going to be happy, is the argument. So that's what the exiles wanted. Eisenhower balked. Eisenhower said, I don't know. Eisenhower was very careful. Eisenhower did not want war, did not like war, did not want to risk war. Eisenhower hated war. Eisenhower hated war as only a general can hate war. He was good at it, but he hated it in all of its nasty respects. But when Eisenhower left the presidency and Kennedy came in, Kennedy's more energetic personality said, hey, let's do this. Kennedy wanted to prove his difference from Eisenhower. He wanted to show his own influence on the world. He approved the mission and then started backtracking. He said, all right, we're going to do the mission. We're going to do the mission. We're going to have American air support. You're going to have all these things from the United States. And then he started thinking, well, this is a Soviet ally. American warplanes firing on a direct Soviet ally might get the Soviet Union involved. Ugh. So he cancels American air support. He continues with the idea of the invasion, but he cancels American air support. He's looking for what he called plausible deniability. He wants the Soviets to believe that these Cuban exiles are hitting the beaches themselves without any American support, which is kind of a thing that's unbelievable. Some of his advisors say, Mr. President, obviously the Soviets are going to know that it's the United States. If you're going to do this, you have to do it with the air power or not at all. But Kennedy takes a half measure. On the 17th of April, 1961, 1,200 Cuban exiles, here they are, hit the beaches at a place called the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba. Without U.S. air support and with Castro's security forces preventing the population from rising up, the 1,200 are sitting ducks on the beach. They're slaughtered on the beach, or captured and either traded back to the United States for concessions in other areas, or forced to rot in Castro's very nasty prisons for a long, long time. Kennedy's been in office, a grand total of 3 months when Bay of Pigs goes down. And he is made out to look terribly, terribly weak. He is forced to accept responsibility kind of publicly. He says, this was me, this was our fault, it went badly, I'm very sorry. And the American people kind of said, we didn't have any of this under Eisenhower. Who did we just put in the White House here? Kennedy took a very interesting step. He decided to get away from Washington, D.C. to the presidential retreat at Camp David in Maryland. And he invited former President Eisenhower to meet him there. And he made very, very certain that, and he asked Eisenhower for his advice. And he made very, very sure that the press was around to record pictures of, the old general and the young president deep in discussions about what to do next what to say, what to do vis-a-vis the Soviets, etc., etc. This picture here specifically won a Pulitzer Prize for Best News Photograph of the Year. You know, you can see there's kind of the older Eisenhower. He's, you know, he's shorter. He's got, his shoulders are beginning to stoop. He's wearing a hat. It's a little more old-fashioned. Kennedy is, you know, tall and broad shoulders, hatless. And the two men deep in conversation at Camp David about what to do now that the Bay of Pigs invasion has gone terribly, terribly wrong. Well, the Soviet Union was not going to pass up an attempt to try to take advantage of a weak American president. The Bay of Pigs is followed by some near comical attempts to assassinate Castro, including things like making a cigar that would explode when he lit it up, because, you know, Castro likes to smoke cigars. There was all of these harebrained schemes to assassinate Castro. None of them worked. And of course, what this served to do was push Castro closer and closer to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev takes advantage of this, and secretly installs in Cuba medium-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. He sends Soviet troops to Cuba to advise and to train Castro's forces. Well, when an American spy plane saw that there was all of a sudden dozens and dozens and dozens of nuclear missiles established and set up in Cuba, this is the photograph, or one of many photographs of the missile sites, when the United States determined that, in fact, 90 miles from American shores were hundreds of nuclear missiles with two different ranges. There's medium range, which could reach Washington, D.C., the entire South, Texas, Florida, and there was also intermediate range nuclear missiles that could reach the entirety of the United States, pretty much. The American people and Kennedy sort of freaked out. Kennedy demanded publicly that Khrushchev remove the missiles. Kennedy said, we are not going to tolerate these missiles 90 miles from American shore that can reach every American city in a matter of minutes. And he says to Khrushchev, remove the missiles from Cuba or we will remove them for you. Khrushchev refuses. Khrushchev thinks he's got Kennedy figured out. He's bullied him at the first time they met. Kennedy looked ridiculous and weak during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Khrushchev says this is an excellent time to test the American president and the American government, and I don't think I have a worthy adversary. So he refuses. Kennedy and Khrushchev proceeded then to engage in what amounted to a game of nuclear chicken. Who is going to blink first? Very publicly, Khrushchev announces that a convoy of ships is leaving the Soviet Union, heading for Cuba, with more troops, more supplies, and more missiles. So sailing across the Atlantic Ocean now is this Soviet convoy filled with troops and missiles. Kennedy now, so the ball's now in Kennedy's court. The Air Force, the United States Air Force, said that they could take out the missiles with what they called a surgical strike, that they could just destroy the missiles and not really destroy anything else in Cuba. Kennedy, though, worries that an attack on Cuba is going to bring not a Cuban response to the United States, but a full-scale Soviet response to the United States. It seems at first that Kennedy has two options. One, let the ships through and surrender, or two, attack the ships, or attacking the ships is worse than attacking the missiles. You attack the missiles, you're attacking, Cuba, but if you attack the ships, you're directly attacking the Soviet Union. That's an obvious act of war, and then God only knows what the consequences of that would be. On October 22nd, Kennedy took a third option. He volleyed the ball back into Khrushchev's court. He ordered the United States Navy to quarantine. He put a line around Cuba and said, okay, no ships will be allowed past this line. That this line will be guarded by the American Navy, that the decision to force the blockade is now going to be made by the Soviet Union. Kennedy was not going to allow these Soviet ships in. He further demanded that Khrushchev remove all of the nuclear missiles in Cuba. He then told Khrushchev that an attack on the United States from Cuba would be treated like an attack on the United States from the Soviet Union. Kennedy refused to back down, put the ball back in Khrushchev's court, and raised the stakes. And now, as just every minute that goes by in this October of 1962, the Soviet ships are getting closer and closer to that blockade line. The world literally held its breath. US forces were put on DEFCON 2. That is the highest state of alert. The only state of alert higher is we're about to press the button and the missiles are going to fly. DEFCON 2 meant that nuclear-armed bombers were in the air at all times with hot nuclear weapons, just waiting for the order to go fly over the Soviet Union. The missile silos were unlocked. Troops in Berlin were issued live ammunition. Things are approaching the brink. The ships are sailing towards Cuba. Kennedy says, no ships pass this line. Khrushchev says, we're not removing the missiles. Kennedy says, you better. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, desperate diplomacy is going on. Former presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson performs his greatest service to his country and the world. He's working the United Nations feverishly. Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin works Washington, trying to find a way out of this. Neither side wants to go to nuclear war over Cuba, but both sides, they will not embarrass themselves. It has to be seen that they don't lose this confrontation.